Good afternoon. My name is Bharat Gopalaswamy, and on behalf of my colleagues, I wanted to take the opportunity to invite Ambassador Farouk Soban, who is not a stranger to the Council. We first got associated a couple of years ago. Since then, we've had robust engagements at the Council, and I was pleased to listen to his efforts on the Rohingya crisis, and I wanted to reach out to him and offer to play any little role that the Atlantic Council can play, however modest, to give some visibility to the problem, and also hear from Ambassador Soban on his views, his thoughts, the ways forward, and any concrete recommendations that he thinks that we could work on in addressing this crisis. So, without further ado, his bio is on your is on the parts list out there, and I'm not going to read out his bio, but I'm going to invite Ambassador Soban to share his thoughts and views to begin with, and then we could enter into a moderated conversations. Thank you, Ambassador Soban.
Yes, well, to begin with, thank you, Bharat, for inviting me to share some thoughts on what we in Bangladesh certainly consider to be perhaps one of the biggest challenges the country has faced since our independence in 1971. It's a challenge which has many dimensions to it. First and foremost, of course, is the humanitarian aspect of the crisis. The fact that within a period of just 3 months, we had some 700,000 Rohingya refugees coming across the border from the Rakhine province into Bangladesh. They've been accommodated in a fairly confined area. I'm sure many of you are aware of the fact that Bangladesh is one of the most densely populated countries, if not the most densely populated countries, if we exclude the city-states such as Singapore and one or two others. So looking after the Rohingyas, feeding them, providing shelter has been a major challenge. And I must say the international community has been extremely helpful and responsive. And that certainly includes the US government. We've had a stream of high-level delegations from the US, and the most recent high-level visitor was the USAID administrator, Mark Green, who committed made a further announcement of US relief assistance for the Rohingyas of some $44 million US. And this is in addition to the earlier assistance that has been pledged. More recently, we had the Canadians announced support of $300 million over the next 3 years. Our estimate is that it's going to cost close to $1 billion a year to provide just the very basic necessities to the refugees. Our efforts are, of course, focused on trying to get the refugees to go back to their own homes in the Rakhine. We have signed an MOU with the government of Myanmar on the 23rd of November last year, under which they have agreed to take back the refugees. However, what is obviously of great importance is the need for the refugees to go back voluntarily, and that there should be emphasis has been placed on their safety and security once they're back in the Rakhine from where they were driven out. So we, that is the government of Bangladesh, but I should stress that my views that I'm expressing here are my own. I don't represent the government in any way, but I will, as best as possible, when relevant and necessary, mention the views of the government of Bangladesh. And my sense is that at the moment, the government is still focused attention on the safe and early repatriation of the refugees. I should add that whilst we had this sudden, if you like, exodus over a 3-month period, earlier some 350,000 had already crossed the border. The flow of refugees or people fleeing the persecution in Myanmar has been going on for several years. The latest, I would say, spurt goes back to 2012. So by August of last year, we already had 350, some would say 400,000, because some have kind of left the camps and moved to other parts of the country, and some may even have been able to find their way abroad. So when we add the recent flow of 700 plus to the 350 that were already there, we are looking at a figure of well over 1 million that we are currently having to feed and provide support to. And I should add, which is frankly quite a disturbing feature, that the flow is still continuing. It isn't as though it's come to a stop, notwithstanding, I would say, the strong criticism of the international community of the ethnic cleansing and the persecution and the atrocities that have been committed in driving out the Rohingyas, that this hasn't really stopped, and that we find extremely worrying. What we think is one of the key issues, and that is certainly an important and positive development, is that recently an agreement between the Myanmar government and UNHCR and UNDP was signed, which will allow them a presence in the Rakhine. We, and indeed I would say the international community, has been calling for this for some time. We think that the presence of the UN agencies in the Rakhine would create, is a necessary precondition for repatriation, and that without assurances of protection, it would be very difficult to persuade the Rohingyas to go back to their homes. I'll stop here with those introductory remarks and perhaps leave it to you, Bharat, to ask some questions. I'd be happy to expand on the future outlook and some of the other challenges that we are currently facing in having to look after the 1 million plus Rohingya refugees.
So I want to thank you, and feel free to jump in if anybody has any specific questions related. I wanted to start off with where you left, which is the agreement between the UNHCR, the UNDP, and the Myanmar government. Could you provide us a little more window into what the broad strokes of this agreement? When is this agreement in place? What are some of the key elements, and how do you ensure the sustainability and the durability of an agreement like this? And I think I also, in the context of this agreement, I also sensed a little bit of contradiction, where you said the refugees, the recent Shangri-La dialogue, the National Security Advisor indicated that he was willing to take the Rohingyas back. But at the same time, you're also seeing still an inflow of the refugees into Bangladesh. So there is an element of the trust factor here.
Certainly. Well, I would say that on the subject of the UNDP, UNHCR agreement with the Myanmar authorities, the key to that is, frankly, in the details. To what extent will the government of Myanmar permit them to operate inside the Rakhine? Will there be free movement? Will they be allowed to bring in, as we think will be necessary, a fairly large number of personnel? What role will they be allowed to play inside the Rakhine? I think that's very important. On the issue of just to summarize, this is something which we still have to see how it will play out in practice. Just as, frankly, we have to wait and see how and when the repatriation process can begin. And there are two parts to the repatriation process. It's all very well for the Myanmar National Security Advisor at the Shangri-La dialogue to say that Myanmar is willing to take back the 700,000. But we had provided, the MOU was signed on the 23rd of November. The repatriation process was supposed to have begun on the 22nd of January. Well, to date, to the best of my knowledge, and we are into the month of June, not one Rohingya has gone back to Myanmar. So what was and what could be a big stumbling block is in the details. So the Burmese have said that they want to verify the bona fides and the antecedents of the Rohingyas before accepting them back. Well, when they came across, one of the things which we certainly did was to register them. They're all entered into a database. And our understanding is that the Burmese know exactly who these people are. They also know that they do not have any at the moment, since they were driven out. As we know from satellite photographs and drone photographs, 350 of the Rohingya villages were burnt down. I mean, that's, some people think, a conservative estimate. Over 10,000 were killed, according to various estimates. Refugees who've been interviewed, depositions have been taken, including by the State Department, indicate that virtually everyone who's been interviewed was either tortured, the women were raped, and many of them witnessed firsthand people being killed. So there's this huge dossier of atrocities, which also raises the question of accountability. So is this something that's just going to be forgotten by the international community? Are we, is this a continuing cycle? I mean, I was in the government back in 78 when we had the first major exodus of Rohingyas. Well, we were able at that time to persuade the Burmese authorities to take them back, and roughly 250,000 went back. But what were the conditions under which they were allowed to exist? As we know, the conditions under which the Rohingyas are existing inside the Rakhine, those that are still there, are nothing short of concentration camps. They are in compounds. They're not allowed minimum health care facilities. There's no education facilities extended to them. They're living on meager rations, and that some of the international organizations that were providing support have now no longer have been denied access now to these Rohingya camps. So under what condition will those that are currently have been given refuge in Bangladesh, under what conditions will they go back? And that's a key issue, going back to the role of the UN, in particular UNHCR and UNDP. What role will they be allowed to play? And is Myanmar going to, notwithstanding what their national security advisor said, will Myanmar use the verification process simply to stall and delay the repatriation arrangements? And finally, how do we tackle this issue of ensuring that this doesn't happen again? I mentioned 78, it happened again in 91, 92. So we're seeing this happen over and over again. And I think one of the key issues that needs to be addressed, and this figures prominently in the report prepared by Kofi Annan and his commission, is to address the issue of citizenship. When Myanmar became independent in 48, the Rohingyas were recognized as an ethnic community. We had members of parliament from the Rohingya community. Indeed, Aung San Suu Kyi's father, General Aung San, two of his closest collaborators, one of them was a Rohingya. So it appears now that they've been demonized. As you know, Facebook has been used extensively across Myanmar to demonize the Rohingyas. So how are we going to overcome some of this anti-Rohingya sentiment that is now deeply embedded in the inside Myanmar?
You spoke about 78, and you've dealt with these crises in 78, 91, 92. And you also mentioned that it is critical to notice the stark difference between 78 and 91. Could you just bring out what some of the differences are, and what are some of the similarities too?
Well, I think one very important difference, which frankly leads me to think that on this occasion it was something in the nature of a permanent solution of the problem, that the degree of violence and the atrocities committed, particularly the the killings, the burning of the villages, the rape, the incidents of rape, literally thousands of women. It's difficult to find a woman, and the overwhelming majority of the refugees that have come across are women and children. And it's difficult to find a woman in the camps that hasn't been raped. So this didn't happen the last time round. The villages were not burnt. They were driven out. There was a systematic campaign to drive them out. But nothing close to what we have witnessed on this occasion and on such a large scale. So this has certainly, as far as I can make out, been, when we compare it to 78 and 91, 92, is something which I would see as being radically different.
The reactions noticeably from India, the United States, the European Union, or however you want to take the European Union on. Of course, you mentioned about the United Nations, but the role of each of how relevant they are, the intervention of these countries, the implications for each of them, and what can they do more than what they're doing, and what would be, in your view, the right approach for them?
Well, obviously, the end goal or objective as far as Bangladesh is concerned is the creation of the right conditions within the Rakhine province of Myanmar for the refugees to go back. I think that is the end goal and objective. And that is something which the government of Bangladesh remains very strongly committed to. However, what we feel is that this is not going to happen unless we see the international community be extremely proactive on this. What Bangladesh has done is we've reached out to the international community as a whole. We have, as I'm sure some of you are aware, currently I would describe it as a very close and indeed it's referred to as a strategic partnership with India and with China. We have, I would say, equally close relations with Japan and Russia. Now, these are the four countries that have, in more ways than one, favored a bilateral solution of the problem as distinct from internationalizing the problem or multilateralizing the problem, or encouraging the UN, in particular the Security Council, to play a role. As you know, this subject has figured prominently in the Council, and in fact, the Security Council, all 15 members of the Council, paid a visit to Bangladesh and then to Myanmar in the month of April. We took them when they were in Bangladesh. They visited the Rohingya refugee camps near Cox's Bazar, and then they flew across to Myanmar, and they were also escorted to the Rakhine, where reportedly they were allowed to meet some Rohingyas. But in the case of the visit to Myanmar, this was strictly controlled, and who they could meet and under what conditions were closely supervised. Now, the Council on more than one occasion was keen to take measures, including to issue statements where the idea was to condemn the atrocities that took place. Because of China and Russia, the Council was not able to take the kind of measures that it had wanted to take. So yes, the geopolitics of this has figured prominently, and what we can say is that the strongest support for the Rohingyas has come from the United States and the West. Across the board, all the Europeans have been extremely supportive. We've had countless visits from European dignitaries, foreign ministers, and so forth. And this is equally true of Australia and Canada and many others who've been very supportive. So there is this, multilateral versus bilateral approach. We have, on a number of occasions, sought the help of China as well as India. I myself, every year, I take a high-level delegation to both countries, to China as well as to India. We've had extensive discussions on the subject of the Rohingya problem. Because what is interesting for both China and India is the fact that there are a number of initiatives on the table focused on regional and sub-regional cooperation. As you know, the Chinese have launched a major initiative, the Belt Road Initiative. Earlier, they had mooted the idea of BCIM, which is the Bangladesh, China, India, Myanmar Economic Corridor. We have another major regional grouping, which is BIMSTEC, which links Bangladesh, India, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, as well as Thailand, Nepal, and Bhutan, 7 countries. The permanent secretariat for this, for BIMSTEC, is based in Bangladesh. The current Secretary General is a Bangladeshi. Now, what we have said to both our friends in China as well as in India, and these delegations and this regular dialogue which takes place with China and India is at a track 1.5 level. So in my delegation, I've always included senior people from the government. And we've had an equally good response from the Indian and the Chinese side. And we've sought their help. We've said, if you want to see serious movement on these various regional and sub-regional initiatives, there's this talk of the Bay of Bengal community, the Maritime Silk Route, because you have Bangladesh, Myanmar, and India, all littoral states surrounding the Bay of Bengal. So the key to this is a good relationship between Bangladesh and Myanmar. Without this, this link between these two countries, these regional initiatives are not going to bear fruit. And I think this point has also resonated. And the other point which I have personally made is that, look, if the Rohingyas continue to be persecuted, this is going to inevitably, if not today, then tomorrow, create a backlash. It's going to create a serious security problem. One of both India and China's major concerns also focus on the issue of security and stability in the region as a whole. But if you are mistreating a particular ethnic group, at some point there is a likelihood, particularly in the case of the younger generation, that they're going to respond and react to this. We know, for example, that groups like ISIL and Al-Qaeda, at least in their networks, are keen to exploit the grievances of the Rohingyas, are keen to encourage them to bear arms and to take action against their Burmese oppressors. Well, we would like very much to avoid that, because as a next door neighbor, this will have a spillover effect inevitably in Bangladesh. So we don't want the Rohingya issue to trigger an exercise in creating extremists. I think that's something else which we've flagged in our conversations with the Chinese as well as the Indians.
Great. Sure. Yeah, I'll come to you. The gentleman behind, and then I'll.
Thank you. Dan Sullivan with Refugees International. Thank you for your comments. Recognizing that the root causes and the ultimate solutions are in Myanmar, I wanted to ask you about the current humanitarian situation in Bangladesh, particularly given the monsoon season, and recognizing that Bangladesh has, deserves great credit for accepting such large numbers and what it has done. There are also some barriers to the humanitarian response. Limits on how much durable materials can be used in shelters, the ability for international NGOs to get visas. There have been some issues, and just not recognizing the Rohingya as refugees officially. So just wondering, with the humanitarian crisis that's ongoing and likely to get worse with the monsoon season, do you see a way forward for addressing some of those issues?
John Rosenberg.
Sorry, yeah, because we are recording this.
Yeah, hi, John Rosenberg, SPG. I didn't hear Pakistan mentioned once. Any comment?
Yeah, we'll take these two questions and then I'll come back. Yeah.
Fine. So Dan's question about the humanitarian aspect. Certainly, I think with the onset of the monsoons, in fact, I would say that we've had really almost unprecedented rainfalls, which began at the beginning of April and have sporadically continued since. So the conditions are extremely important. The government is very close to completing a camp for 100,000 at a place called Bhashan Chor. Government is also moving refugees out of areas which are considered to be unsafe because many of the refugees have built shelters for themselves on hilly slopes. And because all the vegetation and the trees have been cut, this area has become prone to landslides. So there is already 6,000 of the refugees have been moved to safer areas, and it is expected that in the next couple of weeks, large numbers of the refugees who are considered to be in unsafe shelters will be moved to safer areas. So this is certainly being given priority. There is this issue which Dan raised about visas and so on. Now, we've had a tremendous response from the international community, offers of help, multiple organizations went across. Well, I think from the government's point of view, what is important is ensuring coordination, ensuring that the situation is not mishandled, and ensuring that some people do not try and exploit this situation and therefore add to the problems of the government. Hence, the government is exercising a certain degree of caution in terms of access to the refugee camps. That is not to say that a large number of NGOs, including international NGOs, are not working in the camps. So what is important here is coordination and also ensuring that the situation is not adversely exploited. But certainly, in my view, the issue of humanitarian assistance, ensuring safe conditions in the camps must be given the highest priority, and I'm sure the government is doing that. I wasn't quite sure, you said, what about Pakistan? Well, the Pakistanis have offered some relief assistance as far as I can recall. But, you know, we are separated by more than 1,000 miles. The Pakistanis have their own preoccupations, and we don't see them as a major player insofar as Bangladesh is concerned, and indeed on the Rohingya issue, where Pakistan does come into play and where a few other countries come into play, is that the Pakistanis do have a Rohingya diaspora. The largest Rohingya diaspora happens to be in Saudi Arabia, but reportedly the second largest would probably be in Pakistan. And therefore there has been obviously a certain degree of interest as well as activity in the case of the various diasporas. There are some Rohingyas who are also in the United States, in the UK and elsewhere, and naturally because their kith and kin have been oppressed in this way, they are doing their best to try and mobilize support and international attention.
Before I forget, we had one of our participants who unfortunately could not make it but wanted to raise this point with you, which I raised in private, but I wanted to put it on the record.
Sure.
And in quotes, his question is, in quotes, the ARSA massacred Hindus in a similar fashion to ISIS's genocide against Yazidis in Iraq. Shouldn't the United States and the international community declare ARSA a terrorist organization to address legitimate security concerns while continuing to censure and sanction the Burmese military? The quotes end there. And the question is from Jay Kansara from the Hindu America Foundation.
No, well, certainly my response to this is that all these allegations of atrocities that have been committed need to be fully investigated, and people responsible should be held accountable. Now, the key to this is the whole issue of access to the region. What we know in the case of the Rohingyas that are currently have been given refuge in Bangladesh is that in many cases they've been interviewed, depositions have been taken. So we do have now a substantial body of detailed information about the atrocities that were committed on the Rohingya population. Now it's quite possible, quite likely, that similar atrocities were also that the Hindu community within the Rakhine was subjected to to similar atrocities. The issue here is, and who is responsible for doing this? And how, my question is, when the Rohingyas themselves have been kept under these extremely difficult conditions, under careful watch, what was their capacity and how do they benefit from engaging in acts of violence against anyone, whether it's the Hindu community there or the Buddhist community, because there are several communities that live in the Rakhine. We do know, and a big issue was made of this by the Myanmar government, that when they launched their full-scale offensive on the 25th of August against the Rohingya community there, that this was in response allegedly to an attack on some police posts by ARSA. Now, I'm not an expert on ARSA, and I'm unaware, or at least to the best of my knowledge, I do not know what capability ARSA has. Yes, I have spoken at some length to our own authorities, and their view is that the capacity of ARSA to launch any major action is seriously limited in terms of the number of people that support ARSA and the arms and that they have to carry out operations. So indeed, I would say our authorities have gone so far as to say that this has been, the ARSA issue has been played up significantly to justify the ethnic cleansing that has taken place. And indeed, to go even one step further, that these are so-called false flag operations, or to use common everyday parlance, which has become now quite normal, that these are fake stories that have been put out there to further demonize the Rohingyas. Our own view is that if ARSA poses a threat, then the toughest possible measures should be taken against ARSA. And it's certainly in Bangladesh's interest to ensure that ARSA does not engage in any acts that can be detrimental to the repatriation process. So to conclude, we think that ARSA's activities, its capabilities have been greatly exaggerated. What is very important, and I think the government of Bangladesh, when this issue was raised, responded positively, to even go to the extent of saying that if you say ARSA is such a major threat, we would be willing to even engage in joint patrols to try and track down ARSA, because we want to make it clear, absolutely clear, that we would have zero tolerance for ARSA or for any terrorist or extremist organization, because that certainly detracts from our objective of safe and secure repatriation. There was a very interesting story which I did circulate to some friends in Washington. I don't know if I sent it to you, Bharat. This was a study, a report done by I believe an English journalist, who was monitoring the so-called Twitter account of ARSA. So there was a period leading up to the 25th of August when allegedly this ARSA Twitter account was putting out threats about its operations. And then when the 25th August attacks took place, there were further Twitter accounts about that. Well, the long and short of it is that at least this English journalist in his report said that he has studied in detail the ARSA Twitter accounts, which for the last 3 months have gone completely silent. And he comes to the conclusion that studying the language of these Twitter accounts and the fact that they've gone silent, that the so-called ARSA Twitter account was indeed being operated by the Myanmar army. So this was a part of the famous false flag operation to use ARSA as, if you like, the trigger to launch the kind of action against the Rohingya community to drive them out.
So the gentleman there, then yourself, and then I have you, and then I'll come to this side. Yeah.
Henry Hetker, retired government. Mr. Ambassador, I wondered if you think there's any need for like UN-style peacekeepers in the area where the Rohingya would be repatriated to, or should they look towards a private international-style police force to maintain a secure presence?
Well, I mean, certainly Bangladesh would warmly welcome UN peacekeepers, provided, of course, we could get the UN Security Council to agree to this. I think realistically speaking, and we've spoken, in fact, when our Prime Minister was in New York in last year in September, she spoke about safe zones. So where the Rohingyas can feel protected. And our sense is that if the Myanmar government was to allow a substantial UN presence, and here these can, it can be UNDP, it can be UNHCR, and also allow international NGOs, many of whom have in the past had a presence there, to allow free movement and allow them to interact and provide help and support, and serve, if you like, as a kind of an independent voice to ensure that the Rohingyas are not subjected to any further mistreatment if and when they go back. I think that is a realistic demand. But yes, peacekeepers, if we are to take the allegations of the Myanmar authorities that there's a big ARSA presence and they pose a threat to the region, fine. Well then, we would welcome UN peacekeepers or UN blue helmets to monitor what is going on here, because the issue of trying to ensure safety and security in the area is important, but to do it objectively and truthfully, and not to try and exploit this situation to perpetrate further acts of revenge.
I'll come to this side. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Ann Sweetser. I'm a social anthropologist working in international development. In the mid-late 90s, general conversations while I was working in Bangladesh, the fact about Rohingya being in the southeast was raised immediately as a very serious problem by people working in the northwest and in Dhaka. So I'm wondering about general public opinion, but also I'm particularly interested in what's going on in the Chittagong Hill Tracts. Those people rely on shifting agriculture. I imagine that a lot of their land has been damaged. Are you aware of any resistance from them or any resentment about the support for the Rohingya by the government of Bangladesh or outsiders that may be disadvantaging them in some way? Thank you.
Well, I think that's an interesting point. We do know that in recent weeks there have been some problems between the local communities and the Rohingyas. As I alluded to, at least, initially some 6,000 acres of land have been occupied, and I suspect this the number, the area has further increased. A lot of this land was private land. The Rohingyas have also encroached on areas where they've cut trees and so on. So there is a certain degree of friction with the local community. Earlier there was a very strong support from the local community, purely out of humanitarian considerations. But now, this crisis is 9 months have almost passed, and therefore problems are certainly surfacing, and I think the government is conscious of the need to address this problem, to see that the earlier, if you like, support that was extended by the local communities, that this can continue, because the friction between local communities and the Rohingya refugees would add to our problems. So at the moment there is a kind of a effort, although obviously there are limitations to the extent that the government can kind of create a firewall between the refugees and local communities. The effort, however, is to keep them in the Cox's Bazar area rather than allowing them to mingle. So at the moment, although the Chittagong Hill Tracts are in close proximity, to the best of our knowledge, there's been very little, if you like, mingling, if any at all, between the Rohingya refugees and the people in the hill tracts. Having said that, that itself is an area where we have had problems. The big issue in the Chittagong Hill Tracts revolves around land, and we have some 13 ethnic tribal communities living in the hill tracts, and then you have the local Bengali settlers, some of whom have been living there now for an extended period of time. So the coexistence between these different groups and settling the issue of land, this is a matter which has been given the highest priority by the government. We ourselves, meaning my institute, we are currently doing a program in the hill tracts where we bring the different youth from the communities around the table, and it's a confidence building measure for them to talk to each other, to try and create, if you like, a certain degree of interaction and rapport between the different communities.
So the gentleman.
Thank you. Shi Qinzhou from Shanghai Institute for International Studies, China, and also a visiting fellow in CSIS. And I still remember one of Myanmar colleagues once said, Rohingya is not a bigger problem for Myanmar. A lot of such kind of problems, and also it is not an urgent problem for Myanmar, and also it is not a new problem, because usually Rohingyas go to Indonesia and Malaysia, and their destination is Australia. But these two countries don't register these people as refugees. They just keep them there and give them some jobs, but they are not refugees. And I think refugees in Bangladesh is their better identity. And also Bangladesh is not their favorite destination, but it is the most convenient destination. And I want to know a very simple question about is it possible, because there are some other refugees in China, about 10,000, and also about 700 in Nepal, and also in some other countries. Is it possible to find a basket of solutions to include not just the refugees in Bangladesh, but also Rohingyas in some other countries, including China, Indonesia, or Australia, or Malaysia, or Nepal, or Pakistan, to return to Myanmar? Thank you.
I'll take one more question and then club those.
Once elections are, Nicole Cassu from the Center for Global Development. Once elections are over, do you see the Bangladeshi government looking at development solutions such as World Bank financing for a refugee compact to help foster long-term solutions for refugees and host communities?
Well, I'm not sure if I understood properly the question of our Chinese friend, but if I understood you correctly, yes.
Sorry, I think this is the way that I understood.
Yeah.
Myanmar says this is not the biggest problem in perspective, and the Rohingya is not the biggest crisis in perspective. And
I think overall the rate not only in China but also
Indonesia, Malaysia, correct.
They are not refugees.
Right. Yeah.
Well, firstly, I should mention that, as some of you would recall, there was a period when a number of the Rohingyas took to boats and tried to get to Thailand and Malaysia and Indonesia, simply because the conditions inside the Rakhine had been made so intolerable for them. So they were even willing to risk their lives. Can I have some more water?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
To even risk their lives to reach some of these. And as you know, many of them did perish on their way. These were boats were not very safe. They were exploited, and the point that has been made, and this figures prominently in the Kofi Annan Commission's report, and indeed the Special Envoy of Canada also has produced an excellent report. And they talk, and this in a sense also addresses the question that was made by the lady subsequently, that there is a view that the best solution of this problem is the development of the Rakhine area. The Rakhine is extremely sparsely populated compared to, let's say, the situation across the border. And the Rakhine is also extremely rich in resources. And thank you. And a number of major projects are now under implementation. China has several, India has several. So potentially the Rakhine could become one of the let's say, fastest growing regions of Myanmar. At the moment, it is, however, one of the most depressed parts of the country, with very little development, poor roads, very poor infrastructure. So this could well be a win-win situation, the development of the Rakhine, and that part of the tension that exists between the communities is there because of the poor infrastructure and the poor job opportunities that exist in the region. So I think a potential or possible solution of this problem could well be the development of this region. And I would think that this does offer an opportunity for countries like China and India, but also the World Bank and the multilateral organizations, the ADB. And once we have created the improved infrastructure, and it becomes, as we think the potential is there, to become a major investment destination, then jobs will be created, and there will be an enormous demand for workers and people. And that could well then open the doors to attract not only the local ethnic communities, including the Rohingyas, but provide jobs for people from elsewhere in Myanmar. So the challenge, I would say the long-term challenge for Myanmar has always been this issue of, can economic development, growth and investment provide an alternative to the ongoing problem that Myanmar has with its multiple ethnic communities. And it's just not, as you said, the Rohingyas. It's, we have the Shan and the Kachins and hundreds of other communities that have their grievances. So maybe economic development is the solution to this problem.
The gentleman there.
Hello, my name is Salim. I work for the Voice of America. Recently, I visited Kutupalang camp, Rohingya camp. I made a short documentary on Rohingya children, orphan children. It's a 10-minute documentary. I spoke to hundreds of Rohingya refugees in those camps, and none of them want to go back to Myanmar because of the atrocity they faced there, and they fled. My question is, after the Rohingyas are ousted from those villages, the government, Myanmar government, already established some, I think, army-based and some other establishments there in some places. That has been already in the newspaper, Reuters, AP covered it. And on the other hand, the Bangladesh government decided to keep the 7 or 100,000 Rohingyas in a separate island, Vashanchor, you said. So both governments are preparing something out of the public. They have their own plans. On the other hand, they are making an agreement to take Rohingyas back. Where these people will be placed if they go back is, what is the agreement? What is the purpose of the agreement for? Is there any, I mean, I'm confused.
No, I think if I again understood the thrust of your question, we are looking at, in a sense, two aspects to this problem. One is certainly the government of Bangladesh, and I would like to think that the international community feels that the logical, the just, and the right solution to this problem is the return of the refugees back to their own homeland. Yes, a lot of the villages have been burnt. The situation on the ground has been definitely adversely impacted. So this issue has to be addressed to again restore those conditions. What is, however, becoming increasingly clear is that this problem is not going to be solved overnight. That the refugees are almost certainly going to be with us for an indefinite period of time. So it does raise this issue of and what conditions should be created in the interim. And this also poses, if you like, a kind of a dilemma, if that's the right word, for the government, because on the one hand, the government does not want to create, if you like, conditions on the ground which then become a major disincentive for the refugees to go back. So they say, well, you know, we have been now well settled, why should we go back? So striking a balance between trying to create the conditions, and they have to be the right conditions to encourage the refugees to go back, but accepting the fact that this repatriation process, particularly if we are talking about numbers like 1 million plus, that it's going to take some time. So having the need to put in place conditions on the ground which are perhaps better than what may be the conditions at the moment, which were literally improvised ad hoc arrangements because these people were coming in the thousands every day. So the possibility of building, if you like, shelters and houses and so on to accommodate them didn't exist. So maybe that issue needs to be addressed. Maybe the issue of providing schooling, providing some job training, so that during the interim period, the refugees are gainfully employed, or they're just not sitting doing nothing. So these are some of the issues that the government is grappling with at the moment.
John?
Thank you. My name is John Brandon. I'm with the Asia Foundation. Thank you for your comments. A couple of questions. You had talked about track 1.5 dialogues with China and India, and Rohingya issue was an element of those discussions. I was wondering, were you also, or is Bangladesh or the Bangladesh Enterprise Institute also talking with Indonesia and Malaysia, where one gentleman talked about refugees or people, trying to get to? Are you having discussions with those governments? The second thing is that in my time that times that I've visited Myanmar, when I've brought up the issue of the Rohingya, I was quickly corrected, and I was told that the term does not exist, and that this is something that's been fabricated, and that they refer to them as illegal Bengalis. And so when you discuss, or when Bangladesh discusses with Myanmar, how it seems that they almost become epileptic about, if the word Rohingya is used, how do you refer to them? And and I think the question about citizenship, you're right. There were times where they had the right to vote under UNU, the 50s and 60s, and the 1982 citizenship law of Burma says that in order for a person to be a citizen there, you have to prove that your residency or your ancestry goes back, that they were living in that territory since the First Anglo-Burman War, which was between 1824 and 1826. That would be very hard to, I think, come up with that documentation, especially now with burnt villages.
Well, in brief, we've kind of, yes, as John correctly pointed out, the Rohingyas are extremely, I beg your pardon, the Burmese government is extremely allergic to the use of the term Rohingya. But again, as you pointed out, John, this happened relatively late in the day, and so we know, for example, and there's been extensive writing and documentation about the fact that the Rohingyas as an ethnic community have a long history going back 500 years, and there are various streams to the what we refer to as the Rohingyas today, going back to Arab traders and the Mughal army, and finally to the British rule, where Burma and India were run under a single British administration, and where people were taken across from different parts of India, including what is Bengal today, to work in. Our point is that these are people, whether you refuse to acknowledge them today as Rohingyas, we continue to refer to them as Rohingyas. I think the agreement in the between the two countries is that we refer to them as Muslims in the Rakhine. But the key issue is, and what are their rights in terms of citizenship, and that is perhaps one of the key issues in terms of the future of the Rohingyas. Is can we find a mutually acceptable solution to this problem, which addresses the issue of citizenship? Particularly, as you have said, that, and in a sense, it's also been a case of shifting goalposts on the issue of citizenship, and for them to, and what we know is, and I stand to be corrected, that when it comes to establishing whether these are people who have come across from the Rakhine, the Burmese have a very clear idea of the antecedents of each and every one of these persons. So if they want to take them back, there are many ways of their doing so without seeking, if you like, documentation, which they know that the refugees currently don't have, because they were, literally had to flee for their lives, and many lives were lost in the process. So for them suddenly to produce documentation is, we think, totally unrealistic and unacceptable. So this is an issue which has to be addressed. It was figured prominently in the Kofi Annan report, and we hope that if the desire and intention of the Myanmar government is to find a permanent solution to this problem, that they will find their way to resolving this issue of citizenship. They know that what we can say with great certainty is that there has been, since Bangladesh became an independent country in 1971, there has been zero migration from what is Bangladesh today to what is Myanmar. One of the most heavily manned parts of the Myanmar border is the Myanmar-Bangladesh border. And so the question of, and given the conditions that the Rohingyas are living in, who in his right mind from Bangladesh would want to migrate from Bangladesh into the Rakhine?
Masood Mostajabi, Atlantic Council.
Could you speak into them?
Yes, sorry. I had two questions. Something you touched on was a little bit extremism, security, and the spillover. And you did touch on the Karen. So I'm wondering if you could expand your thoughts on the other minority groups in Myanmar, possible implications there. There was, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, a recent bombing in Myanmar. So I'm wondering more so about the Karen, the Shan, and what your thoughts are on them. And then the other is, although we don't seem too heavily invested on human rights here in Washington, how do we bring more attention to this in order to bring about what we basically coined an ethnic cleansing genocide, what is clearly that, and bringing a possible resolution to both the Rohingya and the situation there?
Well, here again, if I understood you correctly, yes, I would think from the point of view of the international community and the United States in particular, that the challenge is to try and get Myanmar, which most people feel that at least one of the benefits of moving away from many years of not only army rule but isolation from the international community. So that the two major changes that have taken place in Myanmar, one is the return to democracy. We could refer to it, of course, as democracy with Burmese characteristics, because as we know, 25% of the seats in parliament are reserved for the army. The army still controls three key ministries, including defense and home or interior, so that law and order is still very much the preserve of the armed forces. We know that the battle between the Myanmar army and various ethnic groups continues, as it has now literally for almost 70 years since Burma became independent. But Burma is also emerging as a major investment destination, and the stability of Burma is now of crucial importance. It's a member of ASEAN, and as I mentioned earlier, there are so many regional and sub-regional initiatives which involve Myanmar. So really the challenge for the friends of Myanmar, in particular ASEAN, and this goes back to a point which I didn't address, which is John's point about Malaysia and Indonesia. We know that, for example, Malaysia and Indonesia are two countries which are fairly proactive in trying quietly to persuade Myanmar to do the right thing insofar as the Muslim minorities are concerned. Because one of the things we need to underscore in the case of Myanmar is that the Rohingyas are not the only Muslim community inside Myanmar. There are Muslims all across. There's a big Muslim community in Rangoon, in Mandalay, and in other parts of Myanmar. So it's this treatment and that part of the, if you like, xenophobia that has been in evidence in the case of some of the Buddhist extremist communities has been to make this into a kind of anti-Muslim issue. Similarly, in the case of some of the ethnic communities, it's triggered partly by a sense of, Burma for the Burmese Buddhists only. So how do you address that issue while at the same time trying to get Burma out of that period of isolation and focus on economic development, because it is undoubtedly a country enormously rich in resources. But at the moment, one of the challenges, and we are also on the receiving end of this, as you know, Burma is a major transit route for drugs and drug trafficking. And we are currently, one of the problems which Bangladesh is facing is that many of the drugs end up as a part of the transit route through Bangladesh. And so, getting Burma, as it were, more plugged in to the international community. So tackling both the ethnic issues, the religious issues, and the criminal activities that are, in a sense, characterized the Burma of old, weaning Burma away from that to become a more, if you like, established player within ASEAN, within the international community. So we see ASEAN as playing a very important role, and I think certainly our understanding is that Malaysia and Indonesia in particular have been trying to do precisely that.
That note, I just wanted to add that count us in your efforts towards addressing this crisis.
Sorry?
Count us, the Atlantic Council, in your efforts in addressing this crisis. And in any modest way that we could help, we'd be more than happy to help. Thank you, and I want to take the next 5 minutes for you to informally interact with our guests.
Sure.
Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.